This is the International Anthony Burgess Foundation podcast. A Clockwork Orange on the Stage, Part 1. In this episode, the Burgess Foundation's Will Carr talks to the award-winning playwright John Godber about his 1976 adaptation of A Clockwork Orange. This adaptation was the first time that the novel had been brought to the stage and provided a key influence to Burgess when he eventually wrote his own version, A Clockwork Orange, a Play with Music, in 1987. John trained as a drama teacher at Bretton Hall College before becoming artistic director of Hull Truck Theatre Company. He is one of Britain's most acclaimed playwrights and has delighted audiences for over 40 years with plays including Bouncers, Up and Under, and Happy Families. In 2018 he was awarded the OBE for services to the arts. He is currently the creative director of the Theatre Royal Wakefield and artistic director of the John Godber Company. This interview was conducted to coincide with the online exhibition A Clockwork Orange on Stage, now open on our website, www.anthonyburgess.org.
Well, hi John, thanks so much for joining us for this podcast about A Clockwork Orange on Stage. Perhaps not enough people know that you wrote an adaptation of Clockwork Orange back in 1976 for the theatre, and it would be great if you could tell us all about it. So I wanted to start by asking, how did you come to A Clockwork Orange? Was it via the novel or Stanley Kubrick's film or some other means?
I think I read the novel first, and then I was taken by the film. And then what had happened, I was training to be a drama teacher at Bretton Hall College near Wakefield. And as part of your third year, you had to direct a play because it was very much the learning by doing philosophy that was alive at Bretton in those days. And I approached the head of drama, a fellow called John Hodgson, and said, I'd like to write my own play. And he said, well, nobody can write their own play. They're not good enough. And I said, well, what if I adapted a novel and brought it to you? Would you think about letting me do it? And he said, yeah, but the likelihood is zero. So I went away, and over that Christmas, which would be 1976, I think, I sat down in the chair in my mum's living room, and I got a pen out, and I adapted the book into a stage play, and it just felt like a piece of. It was very easy because I guess I was a Leeds United supporter. There was a lot of macho things around the film. There's a lot of macho in the book.
So was Clockwork Orange sort of in the culture at the time? Was it in the air? Is that how you describe it?
Hugely in the air where I lived. And a little bit of background was, I'm from a mining background. My dad was a miner, my mum was a dinner lady. So to have the kind of attraction of a kind of glorification of violence, or even something that was just such an expression of youth, that was something that me and my friends were very much drawn to. And also the urgency of the book. I mean, even though it's quite esoteric in a sense, there was an urgency about what do you do with the Alexes of this world, and I equated that to the skinhead. I'd seen skinhead fights with various subgroups and one thing and another, and there was something very theatrical for me about the novel. Which in a way wasn't realised in the film. I thought the film was fantastic. The difficulty for me with the film was I found it exciting as a young man watching it.
What the violence and energy of it, the kind of gratuitousness of some of it.
The counterpointing with the opera, the sexy kind of aspects of violence and how it was portrayed, the glorification of violence in it to high-end musical accompaniment. That I'd never seen anything like that before. It wasn't like watching a film for me. It was like watching an opera, and the whole status of the film became enormous. And I remember as a sixth former, me and a mate of mine, we went to the sixth form fancy dress as Alex and Dim, and we'd got the whole kit and the eyelash, the one eyelash and the baseball and the bowler hat and the codpiece and the whole thing. And I mean, sad to admit that, but we bought the whole kind of visual package of that. And looking back at it now, it was a way of us expressing part of our kind of macho through a kind of art form. And that's what I think we found very actually arousing about the book, and in particular the film.
Well, maybe you could talk a bit about the adaptation itself then. How did you present the violence on the stage?
Well, I think one of the fascinating things for me about the book was how easy it became a play, because it's told from Alex's point of view, and it's told from outside itself. And as somebody who had become very influenced by Bertolt Brecht, that was a kind of presentational way of telling the story. So in my version, I had two Alexes. I had Alex, what's it going to be then? And then introducing the younger Alex. For reasons that I'm actually sat here chatting to you now, struggling to actually put my finger on why, I decided to dress the Droogs in top hat and tails. And I'd been influenced by Fred Astaire, and my mum was a big musical fan, and putting on the Ritz and all those kind of things. Right. And there was a kind of fusion in my mind between the kind of glorification of the violence in the film and whether or not I could counterpoint that in the stage play by having them carry out the acts of violence to Fred Astaire songs, which seemed as bizarre as carrying out acts of violence to
Beethoven and
to Beethoven or the Thieving Magpie, that kind of thing. So, and I think because I was playing a lot of sport at that time, I played a lot of rugby union. I just started kind of bodybuilding, and I think that was part and parcel of the whole kind of, the macho Leeds United thing, and also A Clockwork Orange, and also coming from a mining background, but not actually being a miner, being interested in literature. So the whole kind of physicalisation of my particular adolescence bled into trying to find a way to make the violence work without it being actually physical violence. And that, in a weird way, that was the least of my concerns when I did the adaptation, because I'd been influenced by lots of people at Breton who, when we were talking about split focuses, we were talking about expressionistic drama styles. Berkoff had become very much the kind of doyen of British theatre at that time. In his first play, East had just come out, and as young students, we thought that was, the dog's bollocks. So there's all this kind of physicalisation going on, and so in my production, I didn't want anybody to be physically touched. That seemed to deplete the strength of the imagination that would play out on the audience. So any of the violence, for example, with F. Alexander took place where at one side of the stage somebody had a baseball bat, and the F. Alexander was reacting to that at the other side of the stage. And similarly with the sexual abuse, that was almost dance-like. We couldn't create that in any way, because in a strange way, by creating the verisimilitude of that violence on stage, in a way diminished its effect, to my mind, anyway.
Tell us a bit more about the adaptation itself. You mentioned that there were two Alexes. So how did that work? There's one which was the young Alex and one that was an older Alex. Were they on stage at the same time?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the older Alex, who is the storyteller, is telling it post Ludovico's technique, which spoke to me directly as when I read it. I thought, this is very easy to do. We have old Alex telling the story, So it becomes like a parable, and young Alex acting out his younger life. And eventually, that was at a time when the novel finished. I'm cured, all right, and we're left with post Ludovico technique Alex, in a wheelchair, recounting his story. The other constraints that we had, of course, is that we didn't have casts of thousands. In fact, the budget was probably zero. So I think we had maybe 7 or 8 in the cast. So everybody had to, Alex, Dim, and George were only played themselves. Alex narrator played Alex narrator, and various other, again, borrowing from the kind of expressionists, man, doctor, woman, man in street, policeman, those kind of themes. They were just they were kind of ciphers, if you like. But it was so enjoyable to adapt because it just seemed to me. I mean, I was a huge fan of Burgess anyway, and just the way that he used language spoke absolutely directly to me as somebody who wanted to make theatre.
So, were you aware of Burgess as a figure, as a sort of literary figure, and had you read any of his other work?
I'd seen him, and at that time, he was endlessly on Parkinson.
Right.
And he seemed to be. Now, there's a link here because obviously somebody who's from Yorkshire, one would watch Parkinson and think, well, he speaks with my accent. And it's almost like, and Anthony Burgess was always on Parkinson, almost like every fortnight. And he insisted on smoking all the time. And I remember him saying that he was an autodidact. And I became fascinated by that notion because my dad, who was a miner at that time, had gone to Leeds University as part of the Workers' Education Association and had been taught by Harold Wilson and had done PPE taught by Wilson. And even though he was still working at the pit, my dad was, and still is, hugely literary. And so the whole idea, and he would give me copies of the Reader's Digest to consume, and in particular a section called Increase Your Word Power. So to see somebody as erudite and urbane as Burgess on TV, sounding like he went to Oxford but didn't, he became a kind of not a hero figure. Whenever he was on, I watched him, because he seemed to have a real grasp, an overview of political and socio-political situations. So yeah, I was aware of him through, and don't forget, I mean, when Clockwork Orange came out, the film, it was everywhere.
Yes, yeah, it was a phenomenon, wasn't it? And then there was all the controversy about, the effect it had on audiences and all that kind of thing. And that's something I wanted to ask as well, actually. What effect did you want your adaptation to have on the audience? In the script that I've seen, there's a stage direction which says they should make the audience cringe at one particular point of violence. And I thought that was very interesting, especially in the context of what you were saying about the very kind of stylized approach to rendering the violence. Just wondered if you could just describe what kind of effect you might have wanted it all to have.
Well, you can bear in mind I'm only 19 when I'm doing this, so I really don't know what I'm talking about at that time. It was just a passion and a desire to want to tell that story. And I guess what I wanted to communicate was in a way not only Dim's plight, and I was fascinated by the way we make the police. I think there's a line in it where he talks about thugs being enrolled into the police force. That was very interesting to me. Alex's natural penchant for violence, and a really seminal line, which I use even now, is I think it's something like, I see what is right and approve, but I do what is wrong. So there is something in the novel for me, in the way I assimilated it, that saw the book very much as a parable, and a parable for those times, and a parable for how we deal with violent and potentially violent youth, which in a way, looking back at it, at the age of 64, the film, without question, because it took a particularly what's the word? I want to say theatrical, but that's not quite right. But it did make the opera. It made it an opera in a way that I didn't think the novel was an opera to me. The novel, the novella to me is a parable, and the film became operatic, and that's what made it so confusing to an adolescent to be appalled by the violence, but also physically aroused by the violence. And that dialectic, that paradox, I think is what is fascinating about the whole, particularly at that time. I mean, nobody had seen anything like that. That kind of glorification of it. And I think that kind of got in the way of what the message was behind the film.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the endings of your play, because again, the script that I've seen, which I think is a slightly later version than the first one you wrote back in 1975-76, has two endings. There's one where the Alex character menacingly says, "I was cured, all right," as you mentioned, which is in one version of the novel and in Kubrick's film version. And then there's another ending that you wrote where Alex becomes a reformed character. I was very interested in that there was an opportunity to have either, and I wondered what your intentions were and whether you had a preference.
Well, the original was "I'm cured, all right," because that was the original novel that I read, and it kind of left the audience thinking, "Oh my God, has he been dehumanized, or is this fact that I'm cured, all right, actually nothing to do with Ludovico's technique? Has it not worked, and is he just back to square one?" When we remounted the show, and the show was done first of all at Bretton Hall and then at the Edinburgh Festival, and then I don't know if we mentioned that it opened a pub theatre in London called the Man in the Moon, which was the first thing that they produced, which is at the end of King's Road in Chelsea. And by that time, I'd become aware of the epilogue that Burgess had put together, where he essentially says, we're all little Alexes and we all itty along in our own fashion, and then we grow up. And it was just a kind of phase I was going through. And during the complication of working out whether or not we had the rights to actually do it, which even to this day, I'm not sure that we actually ever did have the rights to do it. I thought it was probably a sensible idea to take account of Burgess's new ending, just in case it came anywhere near it.
I see. Well, I've been looking into the history of all this in our collections here in Manchester, and I'm afraid that there isn't any record of you having the rights to put on the play or the Man in the Moon Theatre or anybody really. And but one thing that did happen was that Burgess met with Richard Lewis, with whom you worked in 1985, immediately prior to writing his own version. I wonder if you could, just tell me a little bit about your work with Richard, because he produced a version of the play, I think, and played Alex, and I think is another figure in this story.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, the real irony with Rich in this is that Rich came to Britain. He was a very, very athletic young fella. I think he was the 3A's county sprinting champion. He turned up at Wakefield Station with no hair and a beard, and I immediately got him to play rugby for the team. So when I wanted an Alex, he was an obvious Alex. I mean, he was an absolute ball of energy and straight out of Deptford and a real kind of East End lad. The fact that he went on later to produce the stage versions of Peppa Pig, I let him tell his own narrative as to how he got to that. But Rich was a perfect Alex, because to my mind, he was a fireball. He was on fire. He was wrestling with energies that that were absolutely clear. So Richard played Alex. Neil Sissons, who is a tutor at Sheffield Hallam, played Dim, and various other Rick Bond played Georgie Boy, I think it was. And then when we came to mount it again in London, I asked Rich if Rich would play Alex again. And that was at the time when I was just about to leave teaching and to come to Hull to run Hull Truck. And at my first meeting at Hull Truck, we discovered the company was insolvent. And I suggested I might write a play about rugby league to save the company. And because we couldn't afford to audition anybody, I made 6 phone calls to 6 of my mates. One of them was Richard. One of them is my now wife. And we wrote between us Up and Under, which won an Olivier Award and went to the West End. And then Richard then started to work with Bill Kenwright. And that's when Rich, I think, had the better status to approach Anthony Burgess. There was some discussion because Richard produced it for a second time at the Man in the. It was a massive hit at the Man in the Moon. And again, like you're saying, we could have been sent to hell for this, to put on a play. And bear in mind, I'm a teacher at this time. The school that I'm teaching at, I'm head of drama. They're letting me have time off paid to go to London to open a pub theatre with a production of A Clockwork Orange that I didn't have the rights to do. So I'm paid by Wakefield District Council to go and do that, which is bizarre. And there are probably somewhere reviews in City Limits and Time Out and The Stage and The Times. And there seemed to be a real kind of interest in it because stylistically it was very different to anything anybody else. It was very Burkoff. That's the best way I can describe it. It was very stylish. There was an electric synth drum on stage, so everything was kind of. We thought we were the cutting edge, and there was very. It was the kind of thing to be. We thought it was almost like Rocky Horror Show.
Right. What, with people dressing up and
that kind of thing. And the Man in the Moon wasn't that far from where Rocky Horror Show had started in the cinema on King's Road. But in truth, we didn't have the experience. And I think it's Lee Shine who started the venue with, I think, a guy called Robert Quick, whose dad was he was professor of English at Imperial College or something like that. And they were very enthusiastic about the production. But I had to then, after the show was on, I disappeared back to teaching. And I think the show ran for 3 weeks. And that's when I think there was a conversation with Bill Kenwright about what to do with it. And then later, Richard obviously went to become general manager with Bill Kenwright. Must have had that meeting with Anthony Burgess.
Yes, and from what I can gather, the possibility of making A Clockwork Orange into perhaps a bigger production with Bill Kenwright Productions didn't happen, and Burgess writes his own adaptation at that point, and it's only later that Burgess's own script is taken up by the RSC, and it eventually appears in 1990. But I wondered what happened to Clockwork Orange as far as you were concerned, though. You said you returned back to teaching, and did you ever return to your play?
No, I didn't, because what had happened, and again, this is, I don't like anecdotal, but this is how deep Clockwork Orange went. I was teaching a group of very difficult kids on a Friday afternoon, and I used to use A Clockwork Orange as a literary text to get kids interested in telling stories. And I said, look, this is a film and you can't get hold of the film. It's been pulled. Kubrick's pulled it. And one lad put his hand up and said, my brother's got a copy. And I said, Mark, don't be daft. Nobody's got a copy. Sir, my brother's got a copy. Look, please, let's just get on with this. Sir, my brother's got a copy. So I said, okay, if your brother's got a copy, mate, here is a note. Go home and bring me the copy. So I sent this lad out of the lesson across the council estate, and he came back with a VHS of A Clockwork Orange.
And did you show it to them all?
Well, I couldn't because it had been banned. But the point I'm making is that it was such an influence. It had somebody somehow in a mining village in West Yorkshire in 1981 had got a bootleg Betamax version of the film. Now, where had they got it from? I had no idea. The only other place since then, and up to maybe even 30 years ago, where you could see A Clockwork Orange was, I don't know if you know Paris well, but behind the Shakespearean bookshop near the Notre Dame, there's a little cinema. And it was playing there almost constantly. Nowhere else on the planet, to my knowledge, could you see the film, except from down Emsall, where this kid on the council estate had got a VHS version. But it had become like gold. And there are so many other apocryphal stories. Because, for example, before I started the adaptation, a lot of Leeds fans started to emulate the behaviour of the Droogs, and it hit a lot of the press. And unfortunately, and again, this is as I remember it, and it's utterly bizarre, some skinheads beat some sheep with some sticks near the village I grew up in, and it got in the local press. And they were doing it, and they were imitating the scene in the subway from A Clockwork Orange. Now, that's both a testament to its power and also to the danger, the ludicrousness of unleashing that kind of romantic glorification of violence out to a kind of, fertile adolescent mind that didn't know what to do with that information.
And what happened next for you then? I mean, you said you went on to write Up and Under, which is a very different kind of work, and there's Bouncers and Toys of Age and many other very successful plays. But where do you think A Clockwork Orange kind of fits into your, into your story as a playwright and director?
Oh, it's right at the beginning. What's fascinating is when I came to Hull, I came to run a theatre company that, as I said, was insolvent. But my own research degree, I did a master's degree at Leeds, and then I did a PhD in a guy called John McKendrick, who was very much influenced by the German expressionists and quite esoteric work. And had I gone to London to be a playwright, Clockwork Orange would have been one of the things I probably would have put on. Coming to Hull in 1984, there wasn't a really big demand for German expressionist theatre work of the Weimar Republic, and that's why I wrote Up and Under. And in a way, I had to turn my back on that style of work because as someone who was charged with running a venue and directing in a venue and making work for a venue, it would have closed that venue in Hull probably in a fortnight. And the reason I wrote Up and Under was simply to appeal to a constituency that was interested in rugby league. I myself had played rugby union. It's not a big leap, but in some instances, you might say you cross the Great Divide. So I had to subjugate some of what had got me into theatre to start with when I came to run Hull Truck. Now, if you were to say, did the work on A Clockwork Orange influence any of my work? Yes, without question. It's there in Bouncers. There's a kind of, I think what somebody in the Times said, snarlingly Jacobean kind of feel to the work, a darkness to the work, an edge to the work. I was actually, I couldn't bring myself to watch the RSC version. I don't know if it's good, bad, or indifferent. But I read the Burgess published version, and I actually sat down and thought, oh, it's not that different to mine. So what I did must have been it must have been something that Burgess might have liked had he seen it.
Burgess never did see it, as far as we know, but he certainly read it because we found a copy of your script. It's the 1984 version, so it's got both endings in it. And we got a copy of it here in our collections, and correspondence alongside it, which shows that Burgess wrote back to his agent saying, yes, let them get on with it. This, which is a very brief one-line kind of letter. But what he doesn't mention is his conversation with Richard Lewis. He doesn't at all anywhere note that, in fact, that certain elements of your version, the kind of limited cast, the stylized approach to violence, very highly choreographed stage business, the sort of almost expressionist, if I might say, approach that he takes. He doesn't mention any of that, but it seems to me, at least, that Burgess's version does in fact owe a great deal to yours, and it's pretty clear from the timeline that he read it just at the moment that he was writing his own. So, which is one of the reasons that I think that your version is such an important part of the story. It may be that Burgess would have done his own adaptation anyway, but the form that it took and the end product, I think, owes a lot to the script that he read in 1985.
Yeah, that is fascinating, and it's very interesting going back to it because there is still something very potent in the story. And the brilliance of the Argo and the way that he uses very economic storytelling and just the way he captures the danger of Alex, quite separate to the whole thing about how do we subjugate violence and brainwashing and societal change and all those kind of things. And it's my kids read it recently, and they are they're graduates, and they said, "Oh wow, that still has got something to say about how we are today."
I think that sounds like a good moment to end. Actually, thank you very much, John, for telling us the story of your Clockwork Orange.
It's been a pleasure.
You have been listening to the International Anthony Burgess Foundation podcast. More information about John Godber's work can be found at thejohngodbercompany.co.uk. For more about Anthony Burgess and the work of the Burgess Foundation, visit www.anthonyburgess.org. If you've enjoyed listening to the podcast, why not leave us a review and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts?